Welcome to LevelUp, the podcast where we explore the ideas, people, and events shaping our world from an African perspective. In a few weeks, the G20 summit comes to South Africa, the first time an African nation holds the presidency. It's a moment rich with both symbolism and responsibility in the midst of global turmoil. Following Brazil's call for a just world and a sustainable planet, South Africa takes the stage under the theme Solidarity, Equality, and Sustainability. But what does that really mean for Africa, for entrepreneurs, and for the future of inclusive global growth? My guest today is Ercilia Mata Ubisse, Regional Head for Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, ANDE for short, and a member of the Startup 20 Foundations and Alliances Taskforce. She brings sharp insights into how innovation, small businesses, and regional collaboration connect to this year's G20 priorities. Thank you for coming in, and thank you for taking the time to come and chat with us about all of the things, because more than anything, I think South Africans are hearing a lot about G20, but there are also many other forums happening around G20.
Yeah.
So let's start with your stream, which is Startup 20, and what that means and how it is evolving leading up to the main conference with the heads of state.
Right. So again, thank you for inviting me. It's great to kind of like be here and have this conversation. I think that first of all, for me, it was a privilege to be included as part of the Startup 20 process. The Startup 20 is for South Africa is going to be, I think, being quite unique. So it's the youngest engagement group in the G20 engagement groups. There are, I want to say 13. And this one is the youngest that was started off by India in 2023. And when it did start, it took that name because also of the kinds of businesses that were being looked at and incorporated and encompassed under that banner. So tech startups and such. And as that kind of moved on, I think the mandate then got handed over to Brazil. It still remained within that space. So startups in the definition as the world knows it. But for South Africa was the first one to take the step and say, well, we don't just want to think about startups. We also need to think about very intentionally about MSMEs. And so now the Startup 20, definition, at least under the South African presidency, includes for the first time, micro, small, and medium-sized businesses that might not be only tech focused, or that might not be within that particular, stage of life that we call startup. So that aspect of it, first of all, I think is important to mention. And then the other one as well, the other uniqueness that South Africa has brought onto the Startup 20 is the inclusion of a focus around township and rural businesses and rural enterprises. So that is a specific task force under the Startup 20, which is also very real to the economic realities of South Africa, but also picks up on the conversation that was started by Brazil with Favela 20. They were the first ones to kind of start that conversation around peri-urban economies and what that looked like. Although very anchored in favelas, but which is a term, right? But the reality is very similar across most of the global South when we think about it. So, favelas there, townships here, slums in other places, but ultimately whole economies that exist in the periphery of larger urban economies. And
more kind of established ways of making business, more informal economies.
Exactly. And informal and formal, but the point is still separate and still very different, right? Still very contextualized and very specific. So in the way that, and in the way that business is thought of, and even the way that it starts, like the idea of that entrepreneurship gets triggered, So for the majority of context, when we think about a startup, it's like, it's startups tend to start very, what's word? It's like you're driven by a problem that you want to find a solution for, right? Most startups are trying to solve for a problem. But the businesses that happen and that start in these contexts, these peri-urban, these separate economies,
are also about surviving.
Yes, but that's the thing. So it's not so much about solving an external problem. The world has a problem and I have an interesting and unique solution for it. It's more about serving an internal problem, right? A survivalist problem, and then building from there. But then there's also the aspect of, unlike a lot of businesses and a lot of startup businesses that already begin with the idea of growth and expansion. A lot of township businesses, there's a lot of township businesses that were built for the township to serve that economy, to serve that space. Their intention is not necessarily to, move to Santon.
So, the way that you explain this particular cohort within the bigger context of G20 also then says maybe we don't quite understand what G20 is and what G20 is about. Even before we talk about South Africa's presidency and leadership of this particular stream within G20, maybe if you were to try and explain it to us as a South African that suddenly hears G20 everywhere, sees it on billboards, what the hell?
Right?
Is this thing? What is it? What does it mean?
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Yo, that is a task, guys. And then they're recording it, and I'm gonna get quoted on this. Okay, but if I had to, I've been trying to explain to my kids what is the G20, because they keep hearing that mommy is in the G20. Right now, my sons point out everything that has G20. They're like, "Mommy, that's you, right?" And it's like, it's bigger than that. So I've been trying to explain this to my kids, and so maybe let me try from that perspective. So there is a group of countries that have large economies, right? So essentially they make big decisions about their own economy, but also about the global economy. So these are global countries that have come together to, see how is it that they could help solve some of the world's biggest problems. First by, shaping their economies, but also by coming to agreements, right? Agreeing on specific ways that those problems could be solved within their own economies and around them. And that group has mostly been it started off being led out of the global north. So being led out of the west. So all of those.
Started out just 7.
Exactly. Started off just 7. So, and 7 key, like the ones who moved the world. Slowly, it's been kind of expanding, and now we have some countries that also that are outside of that global north. At some point, how exciting was it that India got involved, and that Brazil got involved, and other countries as well in Eastern Europe. And why this matters for us now is that South Africa is now, as well as the African Union, now get to be sitting at that table and recognized for the large economic power that we bring to the table, and having a say on how to shape some of those discussions. Because ultimately, whether we like it or not, those 7 that then became more, whatever discussions happened in that room and on that table ended up impacting all of us, because now that became the playbook. It became the way that economies would run. And so the policies that they would make would become the benchmark for the policies that everybody else needed to needed to shape themselves for. That became like the new gold standard. So now we get to be a part of the conversation to establish the gold standard, or at least to shape the standard to include our perspectives, the African realities, what can and cannot be done within these spaces. So I think that's maybe the first place to start in terms of like what it is and why it's coming to our doorstep, right? Now, what it ends up really being is a lot of discussion. So now all of these, like first of all, it exists. The G20 is this big banner. We like to call it like this big.
It's like a big tent.
Yes, it's a big tent, exactly. And in fact, we have like this analogy about how the G20 summit itself is it's like when the circus comes to town.
Well, it is a bit like the circus coming to town because they're fixing the roads.
Yes, everybody gets excited. So we all start painting our houses. We all start making space. We all get ready to buy popcorn, and our kids get really excited to go to this thing. But in this case, like the big kids. So all of our, all of the discussions now become about it. But the G20 itself runs across a number of different engagement groups, 13, like I said before. And it's everything from parliamentary discussions to women, to youth, to civil society, to it has finance, business, it has, and of course Startup 20 as well. So there's a number of different pillars of discussion that happen, and within each one of these pillars, the leading entities of these countries come together to discuss policies around and to shape policies around those particular pillars, right? So it also opens the opportunity for so each presidency appoints within their own country a number of representatives, custodians almost of the conversation under each one of these engagement groups, right? And so these are then the chairs. Let's say, for example, the chair of the Startup 20, and then within that they break it down into smaller, biteable chunks. So if we have to think about Startup 20, what are the key conversations we should have under there? One around township and rural, another around, digital infrastructure, another one around for example, the one that I get to sit on is around foundations and alliances, which is who are the different networks and coalitions that are there to help support the ecosystem, whatever the case may be. So there's like all of these different ones, and then within each one of those, now you get to like go into the space and say, who are the people that are central to these discussions? It's not just about government. It's not just about private sector. A mix of it, different representatives that can come in and speak and help us think, not even speak, but help us think proactively about what would fit into it.
So I think for many of us, we kind of see this, and I love the analogy of a circus coming to town because it feels a little bit like a big show that doesn't have any tangible anything that comes out of it. Does it matter? Is there anything tangible that comes out of it, and how does it continue? So if I think about South Africa today, and the fact that we go into this conference with a particular theme, which is different from the theme that Brazil had when they had the presidency. So Brazil's stuff that they brought to the table, is it still alive in this round?
That's a really good question, and it is. I feel like I keep kicking stuff that I shouldn't. That's a really good question, and I think the short answer is there is always that's not a short answer, but there's always an intention to have continuity. Right. So, and part of that is when the new presidency takes on, every other member that existed before remains part of that network, right? So, for example, we, even as members of the G20 now, when we are working on, having our different policy discussions and so on, we get to tap into our colleagues from Brazil that participated at that time, who get to kind of pick up and go, oh, this is what we were thinking when we got it to that stage. If you guys want to give continuity to that, or if you want to like adapt it in a different way. So it becomes like a big coalition, like a big network of people that you can now, still engage with. So we are still talking to the guys from India. We are still talking to the guys from Brazil. We are still talking to the guys from India. We're having that's the nice part of it. That's the good part of it. I want to go back to the question around like the tangible. What tangible thing will you get out of it? The reality is, at this stage, at a high level, the man on the street, with the exception for the fixed potholes, is not necessarily going to feel the impact of the G20. And here's where it then becomes our responsibility. And by our, I mean like each nation. It is the nation's responsibility to pick up on the recommendations that are going to be coming, because a lot of really good recommendations are coming out. Only about one or two from each engagement group is going to get put forward to the global leaders. But a lot of really good ideas and discussions, and like you said, discussions even outside, parallel to the G20, are happening because of it. And now it becomes our responsibility at the different levels, at government level, at local government level, at, with different private sector partners, to pick up on those and to implement them, because the ideas now have been put on the table. People have put up their hands and said, I'm interested in contributing to this. So this is now the time when you get to look around and you get to see, it's almost like an auditioning, time when everybody comes out and puts out their talents and says, this is, if we were to do this is, I'd put this on the table. You then get to, it's the time for all of us to turn around and to say, we are seeing possibility about potential partnerships, possibility about really interesting projects that we could do together, ways that we can collaborate so we can implement even beyond the G20. The thing about it is that the G20 as a big shining light is a passing thing. It's going to provide, there's going to be continuity for anyone at the high level that is in those rooms. They're going to continue talking about those policies as they move forward. But on the ground, what's most important is for South Africans to hold their the leaders of their constituencies, accountable for, okay, so you guys were in those rooms, and I'm sure you guys came up with a lot of good ideas. Let's have them. Let's see them.
Where do they live?
How do we implement them?
Where do they live? Where do they live? So you have these conversations, you have all these meetings, you have all these engagements. How does the South African get to know
about it?
What's there, what's talked about, what is available?
Yeah. I think that this is then where, I can't speak for government because I'm not government, but this is where, from an ecosystem perspective, where everyone that has been involved with the G20, that has had that privilege, has the responsibility to report back. We have the responsibility to kind of come back and say, from there, these are some really interesting ideas that have come up that we want to take on. I can say, for example, that without getting into detail, that some of the conversations, and because some of the people that that I'm serving with in the Foundations and Alliances Taskforce are so entrenched in the doing even before G20 became a thing, right? Which is really important. We didn't just suddenly become specialists now that G20 has. These are people that have been working within the economy to improve, especially on the entrepreneurship side and so on. And so the reality is we're under no illusions. The G20 is going to move on, and the next thing is going to come through, but we still have to do the work, right? So what the kind of ideas and thoughts and conversations that are coming up are really leading to a number of new projects being planned, and people taking that back to their spaces and saying, all right, let's do this, whether it's G20 or not. And that's another thing from a continuity perspective. We don't know. The point of continuity is really, or the onus of continuity is really sits with the new presidency. So South Africa has the onus of picking up from and wanting to learn from what its predecessors have done. we also have the onus of creating enough material that and documenting the process well enough that the next presidency will want to pick up, or at least will know where to pick it up if they want to. But the onus of continuity still remains on them, and so we don't know whether the next presidency, this is going to the U.S. next, so whether the U.S. is going to want to pick up on everything, or at all.
well,
So no. So my point here is that's why it's so important for the various individual organizations, entities that are currently involved with the G20 to take whatever it is that they can pick up from the table and implement and run with it themselves, irrespective of, is there going to be another G20 next year? It doesn't matter. The point is, we still have an economy to run. And the reality is, as much as we talk about global economies, none of those exist if the local economies are not developed.
Well, and I suppose that is a fantastic place to segue to how global politics impacts the conversations that are being had. Because next to all of the stuff that's happening, there is also this incredibly cantankerous relationship between South Africa and America at the moment. So much so, that on several occasions and in some of the more high-level engagements, the U.S. has not showed up. And Donald Trump has repeatedly said, this thing is all nonsense, he's not coming here, he's right? What does that signal and how does it impact the conversations being had this year within the G20 gambit?
So I can't speak for all of the rooms because I'm not in them. But I would say that the G20 it's scheduled to go to the United States next year. However, we also have to remember that, the presidency is essentially, it's like you're the host, you're the facilitator, but you are still, there are still at least another, and in this particular case now, if we consider, I always say that the G20 should be the G21 because
the
African Union, because we do count the European Union. I'm just saying. But you still have another 19 to 20 countries or 20 entities that you are considering that can continue this conversation one way or the other. And because as well of the decentralization of the various engagement groups and the momentum that some of these conversations may have already gathered, honestly, I think that whether or not the G20 happens in the US next year, these things still have room to grow and go. Now, how has it impacted it? I will actually say that with this in mind, the South African presidency has had a very intentional focus on continuity. We've kind of saying, at least, for example, with Startup 20, because it's so new, we've been very much thinking around how do we create things that can be institutionalized? How do we create something that is not just on paper and that can be tossed off and maybe even ripped up and disappear next year? So I think the idea is, yes, it would be great if everything went according to plan, but if it doesn't, that does not mean that these conversations will not continue separately amongst these different countries, and that these different entities that have started working on putting some things in place will not, try to already implement it. It's why it's so important for the individual entities to look at ways of implementing parts, of that whole, so that even in 2026, because that's another thing. When 2027 comes along, whether you have a gap in 2026, whoever has the presidency in 2027 can pick up on what we've already started here, irrespective of whether anything happened next year.
Well, and that's one of the things that makes me so interested, particularly in your stream of the conversation, is because it's a very tangible part of what can change the economy of South Africa, talking about SMMEs, talking about startups, talking about a new way of business.
Yeah.
And how that shows up for South Africans. if you were to think about the conversations that have been had so far with your contemporaries and with your colleagues from all the other participant nations, and were to think about 2, maybe 3 game-changing concepts that you believe is what we need to focus on to change South Africa's landscape, what would you say those are?
I think that I would like expand that a little bit and say, we had a very big, in addition to the whole continuity aspect, another big responsibility that the South African presidency has is to not just speak for itself. So yes, the conversations and the needs of the South African economy were, front of mind. But also very importantly, first time that Africa is hosting only representative, aside from the African Union, of Africa around the table. So we did have to kind of also think to ourselves, how do we encompass some of those conversations as well? And so when thinking about, 2 or 3, I don't want to use. so when thinking about, not even solutions, but 2 or 3 pathways that we would like to see brought to the table and that we think could really have, could really change, we are thinking about, 1, how do we bring more of how do we build a lot more, locally, in Africa, from things like, digital and AI, all of these things where we find ourselves being almost users and spectators of, but not necessarily owners and, writers of that narrative. That is one of the aspects where we think we need to think about, how Africa plays a stronger, more prominent role in that, because that is a space that is changing the game across the world. Another as well, and not even just thinking about it from a large perspective, thinking about it from, from it's the way that digital infrastructure, the way that business is done in the township today is very different because, and it can be very different when there is the right kind of digital infrastructure in place, for example, when there is the right access. And, we've had conversations where within, the different township conversations that we've had as ANDE, around people who are doing, their business through WhatsApp. But what does that mean if there is no infrastructure, if there's no connectivity, or whatever the case may be, at that basic level? But then also at the same time...
Or you can't charge your phone.
Exactly. Whereas the world is having conversations around how to use AI to make your life easier. We're still talking about the basics. We're still trying to get, the basics sorted out. That how we need to get ourselves. We need to have. So the conversations that we're having as well are how do we even this playing field here? Because that is going to be a game changer for us, so that we stop lagging and we actually start, because we do have a lot to contribute at that level. We also started talking about, things like entrepreneurial education. So if we only start thinking about entrepreneurship as the backup to I couldn't get the job, or the escape as a hustle,
side hustle, even worse,
as a side hustle, exactly. Or even, and then when Phumi turns around and says, you know what, I think I'm going to start my own thing, everybody in your space is like, oh no, is that too risky? Maybe you shouldn't. Like if you don't have the right support structures around it, never mind. Yes, we talk about finance, we talk about we talk about, all the different resources, but what about the social ones as well, right? The support structure, comprehensively. And one of the reasons why we don't have that is because we only start talking about entrepreneurship when we are grown, right? And by then, a lot of all of our we've already got preconceived ideas of what success should
Looks
be
like.
and looks like, and so does our support system. So our parents are not going to support us in something that they do not envisage and understand themselves. So the conversation also needs to be taken a number of years back, because the world, our counterparts around the G20 table are having these conversations much earlier. Right. So and one thing actually, interestingly, that has not, we understand from our contemporaries in the startup 20 space, that has not come to the table at all. It's coming to the table for the very first time, that South Africa is putting on the table, is let's start having entrepreneurship conversations at ECD level, at early child development. Let's start talking to our kids about money. Let's start talking to our kids about, doing business as if it was a normal thing. So a market day should not be something that only kids in private school get to do, and what does that mean and how does it work? And especially, and South Africa is different to a lot of its, to other countries in the continent. Countries in the continent, in West Africa, for example, have like entrepreneurship ingrained in them. It's,
Trading.
Yes,
Trading
but
and
exactly.
Traders.
And
you think about Morocco being a trading post for hundreds of
Exactly. Or if you think about the number of, and even when we look outside of, the urban centers, the reality is that if you were brought up by your granny, and your granny, used to sell cakes in the
market.
In the market, and that's what took you to school, that's what got you to, university, but you don't look at her as an entrepreneur. You know what I mean? That perception of entrepreneurship is very, we start having, once it becomes a big word, then it becomes, it's something that only comes to us later on. So we're thinking about, okay, so how do we take that back and actually already start creating a path for, for Africans to think about growth and success in multiple lanes?
Well, and I think, wow, because I do think that for many South Africans, if I think about myself and a lot of my friends, we all grew up with people. Well, some of us are lucky to have grown up with parents who had shops, actual stores, but many people, because you needed the additional income, many people had some kind of sale, some kind of selling stuff or additional ways of making an income. And I suppose that's part of where the hustle culture, the side hustle, becomes part of who we are. So it's an interesting thing.
But it doesn't, why is it though that it has never become, that it didn't become as almost I don't want to say accepted, but like, it didn't, you grew up seeing that, but for some reason that was not the thing that you were like, and that's an acceptable career path for me. A lot of the times our parents were saying, I'm doing this so that but this is not what I want. I want more for you. But for some reason, because somewhere along the line, more looks different. And because somewhere along the lines, there wasn't enough support for that to become the more, for that to grow into all that it could possibly be. Because at the same time, the large businesses that we all look up to, international multinationals, they started in someone's garage, but they had...
In our office, we often talk about the difference between Magwenya and Krispy Kreme being an MBA. Because it's the same thing.
Exactly. Right? Because it was supported by more, right? And so as we're thinking about, how do we strengthen the ecosystem in that way, that starts by normalizing this conversation and this path, because once we normalize this path, we can take away this notion that even the kind of finance that needs to go to it must be different. Even the kind of, capacity building that goes to it must be different. No, it's still, it's a path to success that must be supported, just like, being a doctor or whatever. And then the third one I would say, and this one is now something that is still thinking about it from a direct implementation, is we've been talking all of these conversations. There's been a lot of conversations around trade, as in cross-border trade, especially in Africa. And how do we, when you are finally ready to do that, because it's not an easy place to get to now be ready to do that, thinking about how do we make it easy for me to take my business across the border. And there's a lot of different, how do we simplify that process? How do we make that process, if it's going to be happening, for example, under the G20 banner, then that means now South Africa is part of the G20. And now that should mean that if we facilitate cross-border trade across, at least within these 20, there's 19 other spaces and economies that you can take your business to, and it should be easy because now you're all under the same banner. So what does that really look like? How do we simplify that down to, whether it is in terms of making the requirements more accessible, more easy to understand, creating specific spaces in different countries where if I go and I trade there, I have like specific facilities. How do we do that? And so it's easier said than done, but we've seen, there's a lot. The nice thing about being a part of the G20 is that we now have a lot more places to learn from, right? We've got there's so many different ways in which entrepreneurs are being supported across the world. We had examples from France, examples from Turkey, examples from Brazil. They're doing it in so many different ways, in which these spaces are being created, that we've got a lot of places to pull from and to come up with something that works for us. But specifically from how do we then leverage the policies that we already have locally with the African Free Trade Agreement and say, right, so now if we are now going to leverage that and if we're going to turn it into something real, it's not just about giving people money. It's also about just creating straight lines for if I want to trade and I'm ready to trade, I go over there, I get the documents that I need, and now I can get to another country. Or if I go to a particular place in another country, there's a space where I can go and start my business because their tax is simplified or, by virtue of being, within this G20 facilitated space. So those are the spaces, the tangible things that we think make sense makes sense for us, to participate in these spaces. If it allows us to now have access to this, to how the global north is doing it successfully and to learn from that and then to implement it locally and even to take lessons from how we are doing it successfully as the global south, back to them, then that already, I think could be a path to change people's lives. But again, it all comes down to these are great, fantastic ideas, but can we implement them even outside of, the tent? Like, what are the nuggets, the specific ones? One thing, I just want to mention this because it goes back to policy, but South Africa has been working with, to pass the South Africa Startup Act for the last 10 years. And it's been an arduous and long process led by a fellow colleague who couldn't be here today, a fellow colleague of the Startup 20, and it's interesting that there's a number of the way that different countries think about, startup policy is very different, and so some countries have a framework, other countries have an act, other countries, and how long it takes for them to kind of adopt it. And Africa actually has a number of really good examples of countries that have adopted an act. But again, the distilling that into realness on the ground is where something like this could actually help us, right? Where now the individuals need to now take a chunk. I say that if all of us, we are all members of, G20 in one way or another. And I found out that if you're a member of the G20 once, then you're a member of the G20 forever. And so now there's this huge network of individuals that are doing fantastic work in their own spaces, in finance and fintech and, just like in ag and just fantastic work in their own spaces. If each and every one of us can just, as we're now part of this, identify a nugget that we can take back to our own space and say, now, this is what I'm going to work on.
Except when you say 10 years that the South African Parliament has been trudging through this, trying to pass the Startup Act, gives me absolutely no hope. And this is one of the things that is my bugbear bugbear with every one of these conferences or big government-led experiences is they all come with this theme. And this year's G20 theme being solidarity, sustainability, and I don't know, equality,
yes.
right? I'm like, what does that even mean? What does that even mean, and how does it show up? So for a person who's on the inside, who's in the room, how do those things show up, and do they mean anything?
I think that speaks to that broader inclusion that the South African presidency is trying to bring to the table, right? Which picks up, I think, I can see a direct line to how that picks up on the conversation that Brazil also was having, which was to say, we cannot have a conversation about, global policy without including the people that essentially are the drivers of the economy in the country. And so that in at least in the way that I read that, especially in the startup space, is very much, it's speaking to the inclusion aspect of it. We had ANDE, the organization that I'm with, we were one of the advocates for the inclusion of townships. In fact, at the time, we were like, hey, Brazil did Favela 20. We should do Township 20. Unfortunately, that did not become its own independent thing as it was in Brazil, but that's fine because it still got incorporated within the Startup 20. But the aspect of, the fact that the inclusion aspect of it, I think, is very, very important. It's making sure that we're not just having a conversation about, like, that business 20 is not just having a conversation about big business, but also how do they include, small businesses into it. It also speaks to one thing that we've seen is we've had a few more engagements where the different engagement groups tried to come together and kind of see and learn a little bit from what the others were doing, so that you did not have startup 20 there in that corner and business 20 over there, and they're not talking to one another when they should be. So that is actually one of the reasons why so Andy set up during this, over the past few months, we set up these, what we called like a G20 entrepreneurship learning series, where we had the common theme of entrepreneurship to have across four different engagement groups, because we were like, you cannot have a conversation in any engagement group where entrepreneurship does not exist.
Wow.
If you're having a conversation with Youth 20, let's talk about how young entrepreneurs should be part of the discussion and how young people should be part of defining or designing or contributing into, policy that is going to influence how they are running their businesses. And we've got very young entrepreneurs, doing business in South Africa, right? Africa, youngest continent. They're doing business.
More than half
Exactly.
More than half the population of the continent is younger than 20.
And they're doing business, and yet the policy around, that dictates how the framework in which they're doing business is not created by them, is being designed by someone else. Someone from Youth 20 actually, who collaborated with us on that, actually said, this is no longer the time when any young person can afford to say that policy is not for them, right? Because so when we have these kinds of opportunities to pick the brains of people across we had a conversation on Women 20, where the whole conversation was just centered around finance and access to finance and the barriers and the opportunities that exist. Not even just the barriers, but like, if there's a gap, then it's an opportunity. So the opportunities that exist to be able to do better, to be able to fund a feministic future, to be able to have a situation where we kind of rethink about the way that we do finance for rural women, the way we do finance for township women, that we do, because we've been thinking about it from the lens of, the white man, right? Rather, and then leaving the woman in the rural area, the white urban man, and leaving the, woman in the rural area completely behind. So these entrepreneurship conversations can be had across all of these different engagement groups, and so can a lot of everything else, like civil society, the conversations around social enterprises and so on, can run across. So this part of that solidarity aspect of it, I think, really came through because the different engagement groups made more effort to speak to one another and identify common areas, which then again, remember, these engagement groups and these, are being driven by people who represent organizations who are going to be here after the G20, after the circus has left town. And now they are really well empowered to say, actually, this makes sense. I'm going to fund that. I'm going to run with that project. Because you've now created this space in which, it really just, I think that the biggest benefit of the G20 for me as someone in the ecosystem looking around is it gave us really good excuses to have good conversations with people that we otherwise would not have engaged with, we would not have been in the same room with. And that now, after it's all gone, we can now do something tangible with it. So I wish I could give you the addresses of all the people that people should go and knock on the door of, but I can say that.
Why can't you?
But I can Poppy. But I can say that it is our responsibility, and this is maybe then directed at everybody that like me is participating in the process in one way or another. It's our responsibility to find the nugget that we can action in our own space, in our own sphere of influence, and run with that and make that something meaningful that we can then turn back and say, actually, this was born during the G20 presidency, and look what we've done with it, right? So, yeah.
Oh, I think that is a beautiful place to end this conversation. I really do, because it's kind of gives me a sense that there are people in the room having these conversations who are thinking about beyond just what happens in the meeting, but also the legacy that's left behind in the country and how that can change and have an impact on lots of people. And I hope you get to do that. I hope you get to be able. The exciting thing for me about SMMEs and startups is it's a real place that can impact one of the biggest challenges we have in this country, which is unemployment. Right? If we could get it right to start 10 million businesses who each employ 3 people.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of that, thank you for saying that, because again, I just want to get it back to this point. The G20 may have like a global mandate, but ultimately it all starts with the local economies. We cannot build a global economy if we don't have strong local ecosystems. And so as we're thinking about this, yes, it's all about, first of all, making sure that we've got the right ecosystem for these businesses to thrive here at home, right? And so if each one of us as an ecosystem builder is doing our part to strengthen the ecosystem so that businesses can thrive here, then, and then also, then we leave it to we expect then from our governments to create the pathways for these businesses, these thriving businesses that are coming up, to be able to now trade at that level in those spaces, to make the most and access these other global networks. Then we've got a thriving global economy, right? It starts here, and then, as each ecosystem actor, and then have government really just make those connections, make these friendships last for and matter, right? If South Africa is having good conversations with France, then as a South African business, I want to be able to have good access to France, right? But I definitely think it starts locally, and so first at an individual level, we're all gonna grab our little nugget and make it work, and build our local economies. But that's what the G20 is all about.